The sun was dipping low over the western horizon when the dust road trembled under the slow, uneven footsteps of a stranger. The sky was the color of rust, and a hot wind swept across the prairie, lifting strands of her dark, tangled hair and the torn hem of her faded blue dress. Every step she took was an act of survival. Her boots were blooded at the heels, her lips cracked, and her trembling hands clutched a threadbare shawl around her shoulders. She had walked all day through the sun and the wind, driven by something she couldn't even name anymore. Fear, maybe, or the faint echo of hope that someone, somewhere, would take her in before the night found her. Ahead of her, the outline of a ranch appeared, a wide, lonely piece of land that seemed to stretch into the bones of the earth itself. Wooden fences, weathered by years of storms, lined a corral filled with grazing horses. A barn stood tall, red paint faded to brown, and smoke curled from the chimney of a cabin perched on a small rise. To her weary eyes, it looked like heaven itself. But when she reached the gate, her legs gave out. The sound of hooves thundered from inside the corral, and a man's voice broke through the wind. "Hey there!" "You all right, miss?" The rancher was tall, broad-shouldered, with the calm, weather-beaten face of a man who'd seen both good years and bad. His hat cast a shadow over his eyes, but his voice was gentle, cautious but kind. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry dirt, and knelt beside her. The woman flinched back instinctively, covering her arm as though shielding herself from a blow. "Please, not again," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of remembered terror. The rancher froze, not at her words, but at what the fading light revealed when her sleeve slipped back. There, burned into her skin, was a mark, an old army brand, the kind he hadn't seen in years. It was the same emblem burned into the arms of deserters during the border wars, men and women who had been punished, shamed, and cast out. For a long, breathless moment, he said nothing. His gaze traced the scar, then lifted to her haunted eyes. "You served?" he asked quietly. She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "No, I was taken. They marked me so no one would believe me, said it would keep me from running again." Her words broke into a sob she tried to stifle. "Please, just let me go. I'll keep walking." He straightened slowly, torn between reason and instinct. Everything he'd been taught told him not to get involved. Not with branded folk, not with the trouble they carried. But something in her voice, something fragile and trembling, rooted him to the spot. He remembered the winter his brother had never returned from the war, the way his mother had cried when the letter came. He remembered that people had stopped helping strangers a long time ago, and how wrong that had always felt. "Ma'am," he said finally, his tone steady. "You can't walk another mile tonight. You'll die out there." She looked at him through tears, suspicion clouding what little strength she had left. "Then maybe that's what I deserve." The rancher exhaled, the line of his jaw tightening. "No one deserves to die thirsty and alone." Without another word, he bent down and lifted her into his arms. She tensed as if expecting pain, but none came. His hold was careful, protective. She could feel the steady beat of his heart against her cheek as he carried her toward the cabin. Inside, the place was humble. A wooden table, a small stove, a faded quilt over a cot. He laid her down gently and poured water from a canteen into a tin cup. When he offered it, her hands shook so badly she couldn't hold it. So he held it to her lips instead, patient as she sipped, her eyes never leaving his face. "Name's Grant McCall," he said after a moment, voice low, the kind that carried authority even when soft. "You're safe here, at least for the night." She blinked, confusion flickering across her face. "Why would you help me?" He hesitated. "Because someone should have helped my brother once, and nobody did." The words hung heavy in the air, filled with a sorrow she didn't understand yet. She looked away, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. "I don't want to be a burden." Grant gave a small shake of his head. "A burden's when you choose to trouble someone. You didn't choose what happened to you." He stood, poured more water into the basin, and said softly, "Rest. I'll be outside if you need anything." When he stepped out into the cool night air, he looked toward the horizon where the sun had vanished. Coyotes howled in the distance, and the prairie wind whispered through the tall grass. He didn't know who she was, what she'd run from, or what kind of trouble might come looking for her. But he knew one thing for certain. She wasn't a deserter. That mark on her arm wasn't guilt, it was cruelty. Inside, the woman, whose name was Lena, sat up slowly, staring at the small fire in the stove. She traced the brand on her arm with trembling fingers. The flesh was old and puckered, but the memory behind it was raw. The army camp, the night sky filled with screams, the cold laughter of the man who had held her down while they branded her. "Now you'll always remember who owns you," he'd said. But she had escaped, barely. The mark hadn't broken her, though it had made her invisible to mercy. Everywhere she went, people turned her away. Even those who'd once known her looked at her with disgust or fear. The brand was a story burned into her skin, and no one wanted to read it. Now, in this small cabin smelling of wood smoke and horse saddle oil, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Safety. But safety was dangerous. Safety made you forget to run. Outside, Grant was checking the horses when he heard her sob quietly through the open window. He didn't move, didn't speak, just listened. The sound tore something open inside him. It had been a long time since he'd let himself feel anything at all. Since his wife's death, the ranch had been his whole world. Predictable, hard, empty. But now there was someone inside his house who sounded like all the things he'd buried. He didn't know it yet, but this night, this moment, would change both their lives. The morning after Lena collapsed at the ranch, the prairie was draped in fog, thin and silver like breath on glass. Grant McCall stepped out of his cabin with a cup of coffee, his boots crunching over frost-stiffened soil. The air smelled of rain and wood smoke, and for the first time in a long while, his home didn't feel empty. He could hear her moving faintly inside, soft, uncertain sounds, like a wounded bird testing its wings. He had left her clothes folded neatly near the bed. One of his shirts, a wool vest, and a pair of old trousers she could cut shorter. Everything about her the night before, her fear, her exhaustion, the way she flinched at his voice, had left him unsettled. She was not just running from hunger. Something far darker had burned that mark into her skin, and whatever it was, he could feel it still chasing her through the cold morning air. When she emerged from the cabin, the shirt hung loose over her thin frame, sleeves rolled up above the scar that still glowed faintly in the light. Grant looked away quickly, not wanting to make her feel seen when she didn't want to be. "I can work," she said quietly, gripping the porch rail, as if bracing herself for rejection. "You gave me a bed and food. I'll earn it." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right. The barn needs sweeping and the horses need feed. You can start there." Her lips parted, almost surprised that he hadn't refused her or treated her like glass. "I can do that," she murmured. As the day went on, Lena moved carefully through the chores. She worked slower than most, her hands trembling when sudden noises broke the silence. The crack of a whip of wind against the barn door, the clank of a feed bucket. Each time she froze, breath quick and shallow before forcing herself back into motion. Grant saw it all, said nothing, but his gaze was steady and kind when she dared to meet it. By noon, the sky turned gray and heavy with clouds. He called her inside as the first drops of rain fell, and soon a storm rolled in over the plains, the kind that shook the windows and turned the dirt road into a river of mud. Inside, the cabin grew dim and warm, lit only by the flicker of fire. Grant poured her a bowl of stew, the smell of thyme and smoked beef filling the small space. She hesitated before eating, as if unsure she was allowed. "You don't have to ask permission to eat," he said quietly. Her eyes lifted to his, startled, and for the first time, a faint, fragile smile touched her lips. "Old habits," she said softly. He sat across from her, the table between them small enough that he could see the tiny tremor in her hands as she lifted the spoon. "You been on the run long?" 3 months, she whispered. "Before that, I was at Fort Laramie, camp cook for the regiment." She paused, voice catching. "Until I wasn't." Grant's brow furrowed. He knew Fort Laramie, had traded cattle there once years ago. "You said they marked you because you ran, but you weren't a soldier." Lena shook her head, her eyes darkening with a pain that went deeper than words. "I belonged to one, Major Wesson. He found me outside Dodge, said he'd take care of me, said I'd be safe." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "He was the one who ordered it done when I tried to leave. He said no one would ever touch a woman with the mark of a deserter." Grant felt something twist deep in his chest. The spoon in his hand went still. He wanted to ask more, to know what she'd been through, how she'd escaped. But the haunted look in her eyes told him she was still living inside that memory. So he only nodded slowly. "You're safe here," he said again, meaning it this time with the weight of a vow. The storm outside grew wilder. Thunder rolled like cannon fire, shaking the earth. When the wind tore open the shutter, Lena flinched hard and nearly dropped her bowl. Grant rose instantly, securing the latch, his movements calm and steady. "Just weather," he said softly. "It's loud, but it won't hurt you." She tried to breathe, tried to believe him. The warmth of the fire flickered over her face, illuminating the dampness in her eyes. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Later that night, when the storm had passed and silence fell heavy again, Grant stepped outside to check the barn. The horses were restless but safe. Lightning still glimmered on the far edge of the horizon. When he turned back toward the cabin, he saw Lena standing at the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, watching him. "You didn't have to come out," she said softly. "Storm spooked the horses," he replied. "They don't sleep easy when thunder walks the sky." She nodded, hugging herself tighter. "Neither do I." He hesitated, then said gently, "No one's coming for you tonight, Lena. You're under my roof now, and I don't let anyone cross that line uninvited." Something in his tone, firm, unshakable, soothed the storm still raging inside her. For the first time, she believed him. She went to bed that night listening to the quiet breathing of the ranch, the creak of wood, the whisper of wind against the eaves. And she dreamed of open fields and a man's voice that didn't sound like command or cruelty, but like shelter. Days turned into a slow rhythm of small, steady healing. Lena rose with the dawn, fed the chickens, gathered eggs, and learned to mend harnesses. Grant kept mostly to himself, speaking little but watching her with quiet care. He noticed how she began to hum sometimes when she worked, soft and low, as if testing whether joy was still allowed in her body. But with every sunrise, another shadow lengthened, the fear that someone from her past might find her. One afternoon, while hanging laundry behind the cabin, she froze. In the distance, across the far ridge, a dust cloud rose. Riders. 2, maybe 3. The sound of hooves carried faintly on the wind. Panic clawed at her throat. Her mind flashed back to Fort Laramie, to the black stallion Major Wesson favored. "Please, not again," she whispered, backing toward the cabin. Grant heard the fear in her voice before he saw what she was looking at. He stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, scanning the horizon. "Travelers," he said calmly after a moment. "Looks like drifters, not soldiers," but she didn't calm. Her whole body trembled. "You don't understand that he sends men after me. He'll never stop until I'm back or dead." Grant turned to her, his face unreadable. Then he laid a steady hand on her shoulder. "Then he'll have to ride through me first." She stared at him, stunned by the simple certainty in his voice. No man had ever stood for her before. Not her father, not the strangers she'd begged for help, not anyone. The realization hit her like a crack of thunder. When the riders finally passed, veering south toward the creek, Lena exhaled a shaking breath. Grant stood beside her, silent until the dust settled. "You got a right to be scared," he said quietly. "But don't let fear write your whole story. You're more than what he did to you." Her eyes filled again, but this time not from fear. "Why do you care?" she asked, voice trembling. "You don't even know me." Grant looked out across the prairie, his expression distant. "Maybe because I've been branded too, and not on my skin, but in ways you can't see. War does that to a man." He paused. "And maybe helping you is the first thing that's made sense in a long time." That night, when the fire burned low, Lena watched him from across the cabin. The flicker of light traced the scars on his hands. Old burns, cuts, reminders of years spent alone. For the first time since she'd been marked, she didn't feel like a curse sitting at someone's table. She felt like a person again. Outside, the prairie wind carried the scent of rain and wild sage, and inside, 2 broken souls began, quietly, unknowingly, to mend each other. The days passed in the hush of prairie wind and the hum of quiet routine. Lena grew steadier with each sunrise. She had color in her cheeks now, and when she smiled, rarely, but genuinely, it felt like watching sunlight touch a forgotten window. Grant McCall watched from a distance, keeping his words few but his watch constant. He'd grown used to loneliness, to the sound of only his boots and the horses for company. But now there was another heartbeat in his world, another pair of hands shaping his mornings. The cabin didn't echo anymore. It breathed. Still, every time he caught sight of the brand on her arm, he felt a weight stir in his chest. Anger, sorrow, protectiveness, all tangled together. That mark was a wound the law had turned its back on. One late afternoon, while repairing a fence along the southern pasture, he saw Lena walking toward him, her braid whipping in the wind, carrying a canteen and a small basket of bread. She was laughing, a sound so soft it barely rose above the breeze. "Brought you something," she said, setting the basket down. "Figured a man can't work on an empty stomach." He smiled faintly. "I've been doing it for years." "Then maybe that's why you always look like the world owes you a fight," she teased gently. Grant chuckled under his breath, a low, rusty sound that hadn't been heard on his land in a long time. "You've got a sharp tongue for someone who barely speaks." She shrugged, eyes bright. "Maybe I'm learning it's safe to use it again." For a few moments the world felt peaceful, just wind, sunlight, and the smell of dust. But as the evening shadows lengthened, Grant's instincts prickled. He glanced toward the road and saw movement, faint, far off, but distinct. A rider, alone, moving slow, studying the land. He watched until the figure disappeared into the trees beyond the creek. Then he turned to Lena. "Get inside," he said quietly. Her face paled instantly. "It's him, isn't it?" "I don't know," Grant answered. "But I know a man casing a place when I see one." "Go on." Lena didn't argue. She hurried back toward the cabin, clutching her shawl close as though to hide the brand. Grant stayed outside until the light faded, then rode out a ways, tracking the hoofprints. They were deep, deliberate, a soldier's stride. The horse had been shod recently, military steel. When he returned, the lantern still burned in the cabin window. Inside, Lena was sitting by the fire, her hands twisted in her lap. The fear in her eyes was no longer quiet. It was alive, shaking her. "I knew he'd find me," she whispered when Grant entered. "He always does." Grant set his rifle down by the door. "You don't know that." "Yes, I do," she said, voice trembling. "He told me once, 'You can run to the edge of the world, Lena, and I'll be waiting on the other side.'" Grant's jaw tightened. "He won't get you here." She looked up at him, desperate, unbelieving, wanting to trust but terrified of hope. "You don't know what kind of man he is." Grant leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I know what kind of man I am, and I don't scare easy." The words settled between them like an oath. That night the wind rose again, a low howl crawling through the canyons and over the fields. Lena couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin made her heart jump. She lay awake, staring at the faint orange glow of the dying fire, remembering the first time Major Wesson had smiled at her, the charm, the promise of protection, the mask that had hidden a wolf's grin. When she couldn't bear the memories anymore, she stepped quietly outside. The moon hung low, silvering the landscape. She found Grant sitting by the corral fence, his rifle resting against his knee. "You don't sleep much either," she said softly. "Not when something's wrong in the wind," he replied. Lena came closer, wrapping her arms around herself. "You shouldn't get mixed up in my past. He'll kill you if he finds out you're helping me." Grant's voice was calm, but his eyes were steel. "Then I guess I'll have to make sure he doesn't find out. Or doesn't leave if he does." She stared at him, her breath catching. "Why would you risk your life for me?" He looked at her for a long time before answering. "Because someone has to stand between monsters and the people they hurt. Because I didn't the last time, and it cost me more than I can tell you." Lena's throat tightened. She wanted to ask what he meant, but the pain in his face told her not to. So she just stood beside him, the two of them silent under the moon, watching the prairie breathe. At dawn, Grant saddled his horse and rode into town. He needed supplies and information. The general store was quiet, save for the creak of floorboards and the smell of tobacco. The storekeeper, an old man named Ellis, looked up as Grant entered. "You've got visitors looking for someone," Ellis said after a pause, lowering his voice. "Army men. Asked if I'd seen a woman. Said she was a thief, dangerous." Grant's gut went cold. "What kind of men?" "Two in uniform. One's got a scar from his jaw to his neck, mean eyes. Said their commander's on his way." Grant thanked him, paid for his supplies, and rode back fast, his mind already working. He didn't tell Lena what he'd heard, not yet. But that night, when he oiled his rifle by the fire, she noticed a change in his eyes. "They're coming, aren't they?" she asked quietly. Grant hesitated. "Maybe, but I'll be ready." Lena looked down at her arm, at the brand that had dictated her life. "I should go," she said suddenly. "If I leave, they'll follow me, not you. They'll burn this place down if they find me here." Grant stood, his voice sharp. You think running's going to save you? It hasn't yet, she flinched, tears stinging her eyes. Then what am I supposed to do? Wait until he drags me back? Grant stepped closer, lowering his tone. You fight with me. You stand your ground for once in your life. You deserve that. The room fell silent. The air between them charged, fear, defiance. Something fierce and fragile all tangled together. Finally, Lena whispered, I don't know how. He looked at her, really looked, and said softly, Then I'll teach you. Over the next days, Grant showed her how to shoot, how to saddle a horse fast, how to move quiet in the dark. She listened, learned, and though her hands shook at first, they grew steadier. Every time she lifted the rifle, every time she stood taller, a piece of the woman she'd been, the one who had once believed in her own strength, began to return. One evening, after target practice by the creek, she laughed, an honest, bright sound that startled even her. You're a patient man, Grant McCall. He smiled faintly. Not patient, just stubborn. You could have sent me away. Could have, he said. Didn't. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat the world narrowed to the space between them. The smell of gun oil and wild sage, the sound of water against stone, the weight of all they hadn't said. Something unspoken flickered in the air, tender and dangerous. Then Grant turned away first. We'd better head back before dark. But that moment, quiet, charged, lingered long after. The next morning, a horse screamed in the distance. A sharp, terrified sound. Grant was already outside before Lena could reach the door. Down by the ridge, 3 riders were crossing the plain, dust swirling around their boots. At their head rode Major Wesson. He sat tall in the saddle, uniform immaculate, eyes cold and cruel beneath the brim of his hat. When he saw Grant standing by the corral, rifle in hand, he smiled. Fine morning, rancher. I'm looking for something that belongs to me. Grant's voice was low. You've ridden a long way for a lie. Wesson tilted his head, mock amusement in his tone. You're harboring a fugitive of the U.S. Army, branded for desertion and theft. Hand her over, and I'll forget this place ever existed. Lena appeared at the door, pale but standing tall. Wesson's eyes lit with triumph. There you are, sweetheart. Grant stepped between them. She's not going anywhere with you. The air snapped tight as a drawn wire. Wesson's smile turned thin. You think you can stand between me and what's mine? Grant's answer was a single word, steady as a gunshot. Watch me. The air on the McCall ranch that morning was razor thin, sharp with tension, dust, and the metallic scent of coming violence. The prairie, usually alive with the sound of wind and birds, lay silent. Even the horses stood still, sensing the storm brewing between the 3 riders and the man guarding his land. Grant McCall's rifle was steady in his hands, though his pulse beat hard beneath the calm. He could feel Lena's presence behind him, trembling but standing. He didn't look back. He wanted her to see strength, not fear. Major Wesson dismounted slowly, boots crunching on the dry soil. He was clean-shaven, his uniform polished, his smile as false as polished glass. The kind of man who hid cruelty behind manners. You've made a mistake, rancher, Wesson said, his voice smooth as oil. That woman is government property. She was branded for desertion. There's a bounty on her head, one that might make a man like you think twice about playing hero. Grant's expression didn't change. She's not property. Not yours. Not the government's. Wesson's eyes flicked toward Lena, and his voice turned soft, almost intimate. Lena, darling, come now. You know how this ends. You'll only make it worse on yourself if you don't come quietly. Her hands tightened on the doorway frame. You said that before, she whispered. Every time you came for me. Wesson's smile faltered for the first time, replaced by a flicker of cold rage. You ungrateful little... Grant took a single step forward, the rifle's barrel gleaming. Finish that sentence and I'll make sure you don't ever say her name again. The soldiers behind Wesson shifted uneasily. They hadn't expected resistance, certainly not from one man. Wesson chuckled, though his hand drifted to his holster. You'd shoot a U.S. officer? Over a woman you barely know? Grant's voice dropped low and certain. I'd shoot the devil himself if he came looking to hurt her. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, like a match to dry grass, the standoff ignited. The first shot split the air, echoing across the plains. Grant ducked behind a water trough, returning fire with precision born of years on the frontier. Bullets tore through fence posts, shattering wood and sending splinters flying. Lena, heart pounding, grabbed the rifle Grant had left by the doorway. Her hands shook, but she remembered his voice. "Stand your ground." She knelt by the window, took a deep breath, and fired. One of Wesson's men fell, clutching his shoulder. The second scrambled for cover behind a horse, eyes wide with shock. "Lena!" Grant shouted. "Stay down!" "I'm not running," she cried back, firing again. The battle raged for minutes that felt like hours, then suddenly silence. The kind that hums right before the last thunder. Wesson's last man was down, groaning in the dirt. Only the major remained, crouched behind his horse, revolver gleaming. Grant rose slowly, rifle aimed. "It's over." Wesson laughed, wild and breathless. "Over? You think a brand like that ever washes off?" He turned toward Lena, eyes full of venom. "You'll wear that mark until the day you die. You'll never be clean, never free." Lena's breath hitched. The words were a whip, dragging up every nightmare she'd tried to bury. Her vision blurred. The smoke, the fear, the searing pain of that night. But then, through the haze, she saw Grant, steady, waiting, eyes full of something stronger than pity. Faith. She lifted her rifle again. "You're wrong," Wesson sneered. "You haven't got it in you." Her voice didn't shake this time. "You took everything from me. My name, my home, my peace. But you don't get my soul." The rifle roared. Wesson staggered back, shock written across his face, and crumpled into the dust. Lena froze, breath ragged, the rifle lowering slowly. The world was suddenly too quiet. No gunfire, no shouting, just the wind whispering through the grass. Grant approached cautiously, his hand resting over hers. "It's done," he said softly, but she wasn't crying. Not yet. She just stared at the body, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't want it to end like this." "I know," Grant murmured. "But some men only stop when someone brave enough says no more." She looked up at him then, truly looked. There was no judgment in his eyes, only an aching kind of understanding. He had seen his share of killing of men forced to survive, and he knew what it cost her. They buried Wesson and his men at the far edge of the land near a dry creek bed. Lena stood over the fresh earth, silent. Grant handed her a small wooden cross. "You don't have to forgive him," he said quietly. "Just let him stay gone." She planted the cross and nodded. "He already is." That night, the ranch was calm again, but the peace was fragile, tender as a new leaf. Grant sat by the fire, cleaning the rifle. Lena sat across from him, her hands still. The weight of what she'd done pressed heavy on her chest. Finally, she spoke. "I thought killing him would make me free, but I just feel empty." Grant nodded slowly. "Freedom doesn't come all at once. It comes quiet, little by little, until one day you wake up and realize the fear's gone." She looked into the flames. "And you? You've been carrying something too." He hesitated, then sighed. "My brother. He died in the war and under my command. I told him we'd both make it home. I was wrong. I built this ranch because I didn't know how to live with what I'd lost." Lena's eyes softened. "And now?" He looked up, meeting her gaze. "Now maybe I've got a reason to live right instead of just live." For the first time she smiled. Small, fragile, but real. "You gave me back more than my life, Grant. You gave me a place to belong." He looked at her for a long moment, then reached out, taking her hand gently in his. "You don't owe me anything, Lena. You don't owe anyone anymore." She shook her head. "That's not what this is. I'm not paying a debt. I'm choosing to stay." Outside, the prairie stretched endless and golden beneath a sky washed clean by storm. The graves behind them would fade into the land, but the cabin would stand, a place rebuilt on mercy, not fear. For days afterward, Lena worked the land beside Grant, quiet but lighter somehow. At night, she no longer woke in terror. The nightmares were fading, replaced by the rhythm of the wind and the sound of a man's voice humming low as he fixed the fences. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, she stood on the porch watching the world turn amber. Grant joined her, his hands rough and warm when they brushed hers. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked softly. "Once," she said. "But not anymore." He nodded, eyes on the sunset. "Then maybe this is where both of us stop running." She leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. For the first time since she could remember, the touch didn't make her flinch. It made her breathe. The wind whispered through the grass like a hymn, and though neither said it aloud, Both knew something broken in them had begun to heal, and not through vengeance, but through the courage to stay, to protect, and to forgive themselves. The following spring came slowly to the McCall ranch, gentle rains softening the earth, wildflowers pushing through soil once cracked and hard. For the first time in years, Grant McCall didn't wake before dawn to the weight of grief. He still rose early, but now it was to the sound of another voice, soft, steady, humming some forgotten tune as the fire crackled to life. Lena had learned the rhythm of ranch life the way one learns to breathe again after being held underwater too long. At first, she moved quietly, afraid of breaking the peace she'd found. But each sunrise stretched her courage further. She began to laugh when the chickens scattered, to curse under her breath when the wind stole her hat, to hum while she mended clothes by the window. The woman who once hid her branded arm beneath bandages now let the sleeve fall loose. The scar was still there, dark against her pale skin, but she no longer saw it as a mark of shame. Sometimes when the light hit it just right, it looked almost silver, like a faint memory of pain that no longer ruled her. Grant noticed. He noticed everything about her. The way her laughter came more easily now. The way she stood taller, her eyes no longer darting toward the door in fear. He didn't push her to talk about the past anymore. Some wounds didn't need to be spoken to heal. They just needed time and safety. Still, one evening when the sky turned the color of dying embers, she came to him on the porch, her hands clutching something small. It was the iron brand. The same cruel piece of metal Wesson's men had used to mark her as deserter, a symbol of ownership and humiliation. She'd dug it out of the ashes behind the barn, where Grant had thrown it after burying the soldiers. "I can't leave it there," she said quietly, setting it down on the porch rail. "It feels like it's still watching me." Grant stared at the iron for a long moment. The twisted metal glinted faintly in the firelight, ugly and heavy with memory. Then wordlessly he took it in his hand, walked to the forge, and stoked the flames until they burned white hot. Lena followed, her breath trembling. The night around them was silent, broken only by the hiss of fire. Grant held the iron over the flames until it glowed, a piece of the past melting under the present. "It's not yours anymore," he said. "It's just metal." She nodded, tears filling her eyes as the iron bent, sagged, and finally broke apart. He dropped the molten remnants into the dirt where they hissed and cooled. Harmless now, lifeless. When he looked up, she was crying. Not from pain this time, but from release. He reached for her hand, careful, gentle as always. "You're free, Lena. Not because of what happened, but because you chose to survive it." She leaned into him, her forehead against his chest. And you chose to see me as something more than what I was." He smiled faintly. "That was the easiest choice I ever made." In the weeks that followed, their bond deepened in the quiet ways that truly matter. Shared labor, laughter, and trust. They rebuilt the barn together, repaired fences, planted new crops. Every nail hammered, every furrow plowed, seemed to erase a piece of the darkness that had clung to them. But one afternoon, as they worked the field, a group of riders appeared on the horizon. Grant stiffened instantly, the instinct of a man who'd lived too long on the edge of danger. Lena's breath caught. "More soldiers?" He shaded his eyes, watching them approach. "No, just drifters maybe." There were 3 of them, worn men, armed but weary, their clothes caked with road dust. The oldest among them dismounted first, lifting his hands to show peace. "We're looking for shelter," he said. "Heard there's a rancher out here who doesn't turn away folks down on their luck." Grant hesitated, then nodded. "You heard right. You can rest here long as you don't bring trouble." The man smiled, weary but grateful. "No trouble left in us, sir. Only ghosts." That night they shared stew in silence. One of the drifters noticed the scar on Lena's arm when she reached for a cup. His gaze lingered, not cruel but curious. "You served?" he asked quietly. Lena met his eyes. "I survived," he nodded solemnly. "That's more than most." And in that small exchange, something inside her settled. She realized then that she no longer needed to hide her past. It didn't define her anymore. It simply was. Weeks turned to months. The McCall ranch bloomed with life again. Wildflowers tangled along the fences, and the sound of laughter returned to the porch each night. One warm evening, under a sky full of pink light, Grant led Lena to the small hill overlooking the valley. The same place they had once buried Wesson and the others, He pointed toward the horizon. You see that line of trees down there? She nodded. That's the river. Thought maybe we'd build something there. A new house, bigger, with a porch that faces the sunset. Lena smiled, a mix of surprise and warmth. Why? Because I want to build something that's ours. Not made from what's left over from the past, but from what we've built together. Her throat tightened. You mean? He stepped closer, his rough hand cupping her cheek. I mean, I love you, Lena, and I want to spend the rest of my days making sure you never have to beg again. For mercy, for love, for anything. Tears filled her eyes. She laughed through them. You sure you want to marry a woman with a past like mine? He smiled. You think I'm some saint? I've got ghosts too. Maybe that's why I love you. Because you faced yours and lived. For a long moment they just stood there, the wind threading through her hair, the world holding its breath. Then she whispered, yes. And when he kissed her, slow, certain, reverent, it wasn't the desperate touch of people clinging to what's broken. It was the steady warmth of two souls who had finally stopped running. Their wedding was quiet, just a handful of neighbors and the open sky as witness. Lena wore a simple white dress she'd sewn herself, her arm bare for the first time in public. The brand, faint and silvery, caught the sunlight, not as a wound, but as a mark of endurance. As Grant took her hand and spoke his vows, she felt something lift from her. The weight of years spent hiding, fearing, doubting. When the preacher said, "You may kiss your bride," Grant leaned close and whispered, "You're home now." And she was, years later. When children's laughter filled the ranch, Lena would sometimes tell them stories, not of war or pain, but of courage and kindness. She taught them that strength wasn't in how hard you fought, but in how deeply you loved after being broken. Grant would watch her from the porch, that same soft smile on his face, his heart swelling with the quiet knowledge that he'd done what every real man hopes to do, protect not just a life, but a soul. On summer evenings, when the sun dipped low and painted the plains gold, Lena would walk to the hill overlooking the valley. She'd touch the faint scar on her arm, and for the first time she'd smile. The brand had once been meant to mark her as someone's possession. But now, in the fading light, it shimmered like a badge of survival, a reminder that she belonged only to herself, and to the love she chose freely.